When Nusrat, who of course was not a Shia, he was a Chishti, Sunni, Sufi. But what he says in that Qawwali about Hazrat Ali is so close to Shiism that it's almost indistinguishable. And the reason why he says so much of what he says is because he, in line with the overwhelming majority of the Sufis, understood what it meant for the Prophet to say, Man kuntu mawlahu fa Ali mawla. That he who considers himself to be under my guardianship and my authority, my walaya, must consider Ali in the same light as a wali, as a mawla. And the implication of this is very, very profound. And when, therefore, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan says things like, Kasam Khuda ki, Ali Nabi se, Nabi Ali se juda nahi hai. When he says that, it sounds like shirk of sorts. It sounds like blasphemy, let's say. How can he equate the one? How can he say, he who has not met Ali, I forget the Urdu of that part, Jo Ali nahi milte, Khuda nahi milte, something like that. Whoever has not had a meeting with Ali cannot meet Khuda. He even goes so far as to say that. When he says the unwan of ibadat hai, to zikr Ali. How do you understand it? Kamal markaz iman hai, zikr Ali. How is so much importance given to this figure by a Sunni, Chishti, Sufi? Because of one principle that I hope will help to answer your question. The meaning of Mawla, the meaning of Walaya. The reason why sanctity is the opening to prophecy and the opening to divinity. This is the hierarchy that we should keep in mind. The saint, the prophet, Allah Ta'ala. That's the unitive axis of Walaya, which is given to us implicitly in several verses in the Quran, explicitly in one verse which I would think is the most important. Verse 55 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, which tells us, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَالرَّسُولُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ. Truly you only have one wali, because this innama is an exclusive idea. Truly only, indeed your only wali is God and the Prophet and those believers who establish the prayer and who give zakat while they are in ruku. And the sabab nuzul for this verse, the occasion on which this verse was revealed, was when Hazrat Ali pointed to his ring in the state of ruku, in the posture of ruku in the prayer, when a beggar entered and asked for alms. He just pointed to his ring, ishara. The beggar took the ring away, sold it, and he had food. So what we're told in this verse is that God is your only wali. There's only one divine name, Al-Wali, which relates to one being, one reality. But that one reality should be understood as a nur. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. There's only one light, and that's the light of God. But that light is of the heavens, as well as the divine essence, and of the ard. That light goes from the essence, through the heavens, to the earth. Walaya likewise goes. God, the Prophet, and all the believers in principle. All of the believers can have access to that walaya. But all of this category of believers is summed up by, embodied in, the Waliullah par excellence, Ali ibn Abi Talib. The one who, they're all included implicitly, but this sabab nuzul, it was only he who pointed to his ring. So all of the other khulafa, all of the other sahaba who were saintly people, are all included within the category of alladhina amanu, those who believe and who pray and who, pardon? Yes, all of them are awliya Allah. That's the plural of waliullah. Awliyaullah in the plural. So this unitive axis, walaya, is one and only, but it is like a vertical axis that comes from the highest reality of God right down to the human dimension. So when Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan says what he says, that you will not meet God unless you've met first Ali. What he's saying is you will not get to that divine essence unless you have started to ascend the path of walaya, encountering the awliya, learning from them, and then coming closer to the anbiya, the prophets, learning from them, and then you come to meet the holy essence of God himself, to the extent that that essence can manifest itself. So this is mawla, this is walaya, this is sanctification prior to the confrontation with the divine reality.
Does it have a concept of a teacher also?
Of what?
A teacher?
It does, and the teacher, Imam Ali, for example,
Like a teacher, a good spiritual.
muallim, yes, a waliullah, but even those who represent the spiritual tradition, in tasawwuf in particular, you need the presence of the haqiqah Muhammadiyya. And that haqiqah Muhammadiyya, if you're really searching for these subtle realities, you need to integrate yourself into some framework that transmits that haqiqah, that barakah of the Holy Prophet, which when you make a bay'ah with a true Sufi master or a representative of a true Sufi master, this bay'ah is a bay'ah with God. According to the initiatic verse, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُبَايِعُونَكَ إِنَّمَا يُبَايِعُونَ اللَّهَ يَدُ اللَّهِ فَوْقَ أَيْدِيهِمْ. Truly those who are making the bay'ah with you, O Prophet, they are making their bay'ah to God.
That was the first one of Hudaybiyah.
That was at the time of Hudaybiyah. And this is what the Sufis have recapitulated from generation to generation in a spiritual manner. So this oath of allegiance is something that you take with God directly. I think there's a distinction between the encouragement that comes through acknowledgement and the flattery that is the result of excessive praise. So the Prophet himself said, if you want to destroy somebody, praise them excessively to their face. You destroy them. So do not praise. But acknowledge excessively, and it's difficult it's better, safer for us to just say stop it altogether because we don't know what's excessive or not. It's always better to actually acknowledge and encourage without going into excessive praise, without face-to-face. Appreciation, acknowledgement, encouragement. Well, there are two questions really. One is a technical one as regards how do we use the media available to us to get certain messages across, and that I'm not terribly good at answering that sort of question because of my answer to the second aspect to the question, which is that one of the terrible problems that we're encountering is the ideologization of everything from religion to knowledge to development, education. It's becoming an ideology, a product to be disseminated through the mass media. And so what we're losing is this sense of true knowledge and true rahmah being the product of concrete human interpersonal relationships, one-to-one, face-to-face, where presence is being imparted as well as truth. Through the mass media, we think that we're imparting truth with a particular kind of message, but if it comes through as a product, it's just added to yet another thing that we've got out there in the marketplace to choose from. It's another product. So the answer to the second part of your question, what can we do, is really related to something far more personal, individual, small scale, that, and if you like, going back to the Jihad al-Akbar, that we will become, by the grace of God, greater vessels and vehicles for His grace, for His mercy, for the rahmah, for truth, in the measure that we are, if you like, less concerned with the way in which our particular articulation of that message will be spread to the masses. Because then we're falling into a certain trap of ideologization, mass communication, mass society, modernism, all of these other isms that are out there in the marketplace. Whereas if our fundamental concern is to purify ourselves, to open ourselves up to the divine grace, then doors will be opened for us by Him. And it goes back to what I think we ended with at the last talk in the Pakistan America Cultural Association. The wonderful, liberating verse that tells us that إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. God will not change the condition of a people until they change the condition of their own souls. This can be taken both negatively, that God will actually make a people much worse if they are changing their souls for the worse, but it can be interpreted positively, that God's grace will come to the generality, when that generality is increasingly composed of individuals who are seeking to purify themselves and not only concerned about purifying others or teaching to others. So you see, we can be caught in a trap. Occasionally it's a trap that we can be so preoccupied with spreading a particular message that we're actually not applying the principle that we're trying to propagate first and foremost to ourselves, and leaving it up to Allah Ta'ala to open up the doors for greater communication. And I think many of our well-intentioned people are falling into that. And I mean this from a sort of practical point of view, that when we have our spiritual duties, our wazifa, our prayers, our dhikr, our awrad, our intention, if you like, to recite at least the Surah Yasin once a day, and we find that we can't do that recitation because we've got to go and give a lecture to 2,000 people in an auditorium, about the Surah Yasin. That is the kind of subtle hypocrisy we have to be very careful of. And so I'm not saying that those who are engaged in propagating it are all like that, but people who are trying to lead spiritual lives must put that first and foremost in their concern, and secondly, hope and pray that through them, through their writings, God may open doors for people. And I think there's more barakah in that than actually in reversing the priority and saying that what really matters is I've got to enlighten everybody. There was a man who came to the Ramana Maharshi and said, I love your teachings and I'm really benefiting from them, but what do I do with regard to all my fellow human beings? How do I enlighten them? And he looked at him and he simply said, you want to enlighten the world? Yes. You are the world. It's a very profound statement. You are the world. It's what Hazrat Ali said precisely in one of his poems in the Diwan, when he said that you think you are an insignificant speck, a tiny thing. تزعم أنك جرم صغير وفيك انطوي العالم الأكبر. You think you are an insignificant speck, but within you is enfolded the greatest universe, Al-Alam Al-Akbar. Very much so. And there's a whole diwan, many, many poems. So it goes on, فَأَنْتَ الْكِتَابُ الْمُبِينُ الَّذِي بِأَحْرُفِهِ يُظْهِرُ الْمُضْمَرُ. So you are the clear book. You're not only the greatest universe, but you are the clear book, the kitab, the revelation of God. You are it. You are al-insan al-kabir, the great. In one, فَأَنْتَ الْكِتَابُ الْمُبِينُ الَّذِي بِأَحْرُفِهِ يُظْهِرُ الْمُضْمِرُ. You are the book whose letters make clear what was hidden. So from this doctrine comes the Sufi idea of al-insan, man, is al-alam as-saghir, the small world. Just as al-alam is al-insan al-kabir. There is a microcosm, macrocosm correspondence. That if we really take it seriously, then we will not think, I must purify myself and then purify the world. Your self-purification constitutes the purification of the world, whether you're aware of it or not, but it is constitutive of the reason for our creation. God created us in order that we should worship Him. When we are worshipping Him in the way that is pleasing to Him, we are consummating the very purpose of the entire creation. Even if the outer world is in the state that it's in right now, inwardly and spiritually we are doing a tremendous amount if we give ourselves to God with all our heart and soul. And that's what the Christian world particularly understood in the medieval age when they talked about the monks and the nuns who retired from the world, went into the monasteries, gave themselves to God. They knew that they were benefiting. They could tangibly feel the blessings coming to ordinary people in society through what these people were doing. The same in Tibet prior to the Chinese invasion. The people, the so-called oppressed peasants, they were the ones who were most fully cognizant of what blessings were coming to them by the fact that Tibet had thousands of monasteries with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of monks invoking what we would call the divine name night and day. They felt those blessings. That's why they thought nothing of carrying all this butter up for being melted in the holders for their lights. So in another answer, Ramana Maharshi said to the same sort of question, he said that if I'm dreaming and I wake up from my dream and my sleep, is it my duty to go back into my dream and my sleep to wake up everybody of whom I was dreaming? That's another great answer. That he makes it clear to us that, كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذي الجلال والإكرام. Everything is in a process of extinguishing itself. It's fan. It's going out of existence, even while you think it's there. It is like the Quran. But it is actually in a state of evanescence, even while you think it's existing. So we have to wake up to that reality. And the Prophet said, Mutu qabla an tamutu. Die before you die, and know that when you die, you wake up. Every human being is asleep, he said. When you die, you wake up. So it's another way of saying to us that we should not take this outer jihad instead of the inner jihad. The inner one, to purify ourselves, to wake ourselves up, takes priority over the outward activity. We had a little bit of that already here, so I'll focus on the first question. The Prophet said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, every child is born according to the fitrah. Kullu mawludin wulida ala al-fitrah. And then its parents make it a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian or whatever. So the fitrah is something that is primordial, and the Quran tells us it's immutable. The Quran tells us in verse 30 of Surah 30, Ar-Rum, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ دِينُ الْقَيِّمِ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. So, set your purpose for religion as one by nature upright, as a Hanif. What is that upright nature? The Fitrat Allah. The Fitrah according to which we were all created. The perfect, primordial human creation, which then God says in the Quran is immutable. It cannot change. La tabdila li khalqillah. This creation of God cannot be fundamentally altered. But it can obviously be extrinsically corrupted. And that extrinsic corruption that doesn't affect the inner spiritual constitution, the inner fitrah, that outward corruption is what we're seeing in all of this evil around us, of course, and what the people who have lost all touch with their own humanity. So the question as to when this hawa begins to take over, and all of these ideologies and all of these false, these fatwas and so on and so forth that are supposed to be couched in religious language, they all come from hawa. They all come from individual desire, a political agenda using religious words, signs and symbols. So all of this is hawa. When it comes, it's a question of the upbringing of the child, the influence of the environment, and the inevitable casting of the shadow of the spirit on the substance of the soul. That when we're talking about the spiritual reality as a light, that light within ourselves, shining brightly, continuously, that's the true spiritual nature within us, the fitrah. But that spiritual light becomes dimmed. We cannot see it within the heart. And think of how many wonderful degrees of consciousness the Quran teaches us about what separates the conscious mind, the reason, logic, from this inner spirit. We don't just have the qalb, we have the fu'ad, the inner heart. We have the lub, the innermost substance, the core. We also then have the sadr, the breast, which comprises the heart, the fu'ad, the lub, the sir, the secret itself. So these are degrees of interiorized consciousness. Outwardly, outside of this breast, or at the outermost level of this consciousness, we are susceptible to the shadows cast by the light of the spirit on the soul, which is our individual substance. That substance which is mutajadhiba, the soul is susceptible to the attraction both of the intellect and of the hawa within itself. So the hawa is our outermost aspect pertaining to the soul. The aql, the ruh, is our innermost, the heart, the lub. All of this is closer and closer to our innermost fitra. So the question you're asking is, at what point does the process of individuation, of being an individual being and growing up and, as it were, asserting one's individual being, this assertiveness of one's own identity, at what stage does that come in? That will differ, of course, from child to child and from environment to environment, but it will always be there. But what matters fundamentally is that as that self-assertion is manifesting itself, the opposite tendency must be taught to the children. The opposite to that assertion of self-identity is that submission of the self to something absolute. And that absolute should not simply be the parents, which it is in an atheistic context. All atheists have to say to the child that is asserting its ego is, don't assert yourself, obey me. That's the opposite pole that the child is brought up in an atheist environment. So it has these two poles of attraction. It's not the intellect which is in submission to God through the parents in a religious framework. It's my own hawa and my parents' hawa. It's their desire against mine, so I'm going to choose my own. Why should I be obedient to them? But when the child is understanding that the authority of the parents is itself subordinate to a higher authority, which they keep referring to as this thing called Allah. Allah is up there. Allah is watching us, watching me and my wife, your mother, as well as you. We are all together in submission to a higher principle. Then that hawa of the child that wants to assert its individual desire is being counterbalanced not by the hawa of the parents, but by the spirit of the divine, the religion, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, spiritual authority that's coming through the parents. Then you've got a chance of having a balanced individual who will understand what we're speaking about and who will then fight against their own evil tendencies as opposed to identify with them. And that is the great tragedy, that so few people even have the capacity to stop identifying with their nafs, to understand that there is an alternative to my hawa. That's the great tragedy in education in the West, that there is no real alternative to my ego, unless it be something divine, tradition, authority. So we should be very grateful that even though we're suffering so much in this country, and in this city in particular, from these devastating effects of religious fundamentalism, the basic culture, the substance of this nation, of this people, is still one in which we're believers. We're still immersed in faith and in traditional authority, which we are sensitized to all the more powerfully because of the deviation of these people doing what they do in the name of our religion. Whereas in the West, in large part anyway, the religious dimension of things has been totally abstracted, so generations are being brought up in an atheistic context, which is leading, astaghfirullah, to such suffering. Well, the way you posed the question wasn't quite right, because I didn't say that rationality and intellectuality were mutually exclusive. I said rationalism and intellectuality are mutually exclusive. Rationalism is a mode of thought, a philosophy, in which reason is regarded as the sole faculty by means of which we can understand reality. Rationalism is not the same as rationality. Rationality is the use of reason, to be rational as opposed to irrational. But rationalism is the negation of everything that goes above and beyond the reason. So it's the negation of intuition, of revelation. And one of the most important aspects of intellectuality is the relationship between the intellect and revelation. So that whereas rationalism says man is the measure of all things and that man is defined according to his reason, reason is therefore the measure of all things, it means that anything that you cannot prove with your reason, with logic, in an empirical sense, with evidence, that ipso facto is an illusion. It's what Dawkins is talking about, the God delusion. If you cannot prove it logically and rationally with scientific instruments, then you're talking about something that is delusionary, it's delusive, it doesn't exist. Whereas from the traditional intellectual point of view, no one would assert for a moment that it's with your logic or your reason alone that you can believe in God. It's your hearts, as I said right at the beginning. They have hearts with which they do not use their intellect. So the intellect can only be used properly through the heart, through something that goes beyond the brain, beyond the mind. It's only something supra-rational within us that can assert with certitude that reality of God which is above and beyond all reason, but not above and beyond intelligibility. God is infinitely intelligible to our faculty of intuition when it is alive. When that eye of intuition, the eye of the heart, is closed, and we only have our rational mind, then, of course, God will appear to be something irrational. From a spiritual, religious point of view, God is supra-rational, while comprising, on the level of the mind, comprising the principle which we call logic, the relationship between things. Truth, logic, rationality are by no means opposed to God, but it's not by means of logic and rationality that you can arrive at heartfelt certitude of God. You need to go into what is symbolically called the heart, because it's central to us, what the heart is to the body, pumping the blood all around the body, giving us our life. What that heart physically is to the body is what the spiritual consciousness is to the rest of our mental faculties. So it's the source of our ability to see, as opposed to simply our capacity to see. It's like the difference between the vision of the eye, which sees outward things. When we say to each other, "Oh, I see," no one thinks for a moment that he's talking about, "Oh, listen, put your glasses on." It's not that kind of seeing. Really seeing is, I understand. That real understanding is as different from the act of visual seeing as the heart of consciousness is to the logic of understanding, simply logically understanding. Well, first of all, again, just to go back to the question, there is a great deal of education in the West which integrates religion. It's not true to say it completely denies religion. There's great, and one of the biggest debates in the United States is between those people who want to have religious education, teaching that God created man as is described in Genesis as the origin, as opposed to evolution. So this is a big battle taking place. The trouble with that battle is that the people who are trying to insist on religion and talking about God creating man as opposed to man emerging from the ape, those people are not using the spiritual intelligence. They're using religion as an ideology, as something they believe in with their rational minds, and that data of revelation has no inner flexibility. It's no ta'wil, if you like, in our terms. They're not interpreting the scripture in a manner that is in conformity with the indisputable facts of science. Just the time frame from the creation of Adam down to the historical prophets. It's obviously not to be taken literally in Genesis. So those people who say we must include religion and oppose evolutionary atheism, they're going about it the wrong way, because they're trying to uphold as science something that was intended to be symbol, allegory, metaphor, ta'wil. You need to interpret all of these things. So there's a great deal of religion in the West, but it's being used ideologically instead of spiritually. But in a spiritual context, or in a traditional context, the relationship between the teacher and the student is fundamentally to be defined in terms of traditional adab. Now, the adab of the teacher and the adab of the student, very carefully defined. There are many, many rules about it, but one of the things that a atheistic environment will find absolutely inexplicable about this relationship between master and student in the religious context is that the teacher has to have a sense of humility and not simply authority. The teacher must be humbly aware of his or her subordination to their teachers and to the Prophet ﷺ, to God himself. This chain of hierarchy that the teacher integrates himself or herself within is one that allows the teacher to impart the knowledge that they possess, not in a heavy-handed authoritarian manner, but one which is in conformity with the sanctity of the knowledge that they're passing on. The sanctity of knowledge, which Sayyid Hussein Nasr has written very well about, that what has really broken down in the West is the holiness or the sanctity of knowledge. And he says that what's happened instead of the last 400 years or so in the West is the desacralization of knowledge. Knowledge has become desacralized. It's had its sacred content, implication, orientation, trajectory denied. So it's just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, as opposed to knowledge for the sake of your duty to your creator. So in a religious environment, the fundamental, the defining nature of the relationship between the student and the teacher is one in which knowledge is there as the counterpart, the prefiguration of amal. And I'll go back to finish this answer with something from Imam Ali. He said that ilm without amal is nothing. Every knowledge must impart a principle of action. That outward action combined with the inner knowledge is what gives you totality. All knowledge is there in order to be realized, not simply it's in your bag. Is there to be realized. This is the difference between taqleed and tahqiq. Going back to the same, the root al-haq. Al-haq is the real or the true. In a traditional spiritual context, the one that Imam Ali is talking about, the relationship between knowledge and action, he's not just talking about outward action in the world. He's talking about the action that's required on your soul to make yourself worthy of receiving the knowledge that you are receiving. So, tahqiq is making real, making true for yourself the knowledge that you're receiving. Whereas taqleed, in this pedagogical context, is simply imitating what you're receiving from your elders without making any effort to realize it for yourself. And that process of realization of the knowledge you receive from your teacher is inextricable from all of the things that we talked about earlier, that Imam Ali says are part of the fulfillment or the plenitude of the intellect. So the relationship between the master and the student must have all of those elements and those rules of adab, of propriety, of etiquette. All of them involve the very kinds of virtues that Imam Ali was talking about that must be there for that relationship to be fruitful. The student must feel the love of the teacher and not just the authority and the strictness. The student must feel that the teacher is a model of virtue, of kindness, of gentleness, of compassion, as well as strength, discipline, rigor, all of the panoply, if you like, of the divine names and qualities must be to some degree reflected in this authoritative transmission of knowledge. Failing which, you're just giving a process of rote learning, of taqlid, of imitation and not tahqiq. The student will be much more capable of realizing the knowledge being given to him or her if that knowledge is being given in the context of this human interaction where all of these values are in place, and most of all where all of these values are subordinated. The whole process of learning is subordinated to the sole means by which we acquire knowledge, which is revelation. So the revelation, the Quranic revelation, but also at a certain stage the student can be taught about the other revelations, but the Quranic revelation is the means by which we learn. And let's finish on this note. The Prophet ﷺ said the first thing that God created was the pen, al-qalam. He also said the first thing God created was ar-ruh. The first thing God created was my spirit, my light, my nur. You bring together all these things and you understand that what he's telling us in different ways with different isharat, allusions, is that the first thing that God created is that principle by which the absolute, invisible, hidden essence becomes known. Known. How it becomes knowable. The Hadith Qudsi says, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. God, in his, her, its ultimate reality is unknowable and it is not known, it's not manifestable. But God wished to make known that of the hidden treasure which can be known. It's always only an infinitesimal amount, if you can quantify these things, always only an infinitesimal amount of that treasure, like one single pearl within an ocean of pearls, if you like. One pearl will be manifestable, and he will manifest it, but drawing us back to the contemplation of that infinitude, to the extent of our capacity and his grace. So, when he's referring to all of these means by which he becomes known, the prophetic reality, the qalam, the spirit, all of these relate to the deepest understanding of what we have within ourselves, the intellect. This is why Hazrat Ali says that one of the purposes for God sending the prophets to mankind, again this goes back to that all-important sermon, number 1 of the Natural Balagha. He says, one of the principal reasons why God sent messengers to mankind is لِيُثِيرَ لَهُمْ دَفَائِنْ الْعُقُولِ, that God may unearth for them, for mankind, dafa'in al-uqul, the hidden treasures, the things that are buried of the intellect. So buried deep within our intellects, our consciousness, are these treasures that, if you like, are the individual subjective reflection within ourselves of that treasure that is hidden above all things, the hidden treasure of the divine essence. So one of the great lessons of the Natural Balagha, and in sermon number 1, is to teach this complementarity between reason and revelation, between the intellect understood as comprising buried treasures and not simply logic. That's not a buried treasure. Logical equations and rational comprehension cannot be referred to as a hidden treasure. What are the hidden treasures? Are the things that Imam Ali referred to when he said, if I wanted to, I could talk to you about the things that have been revealed to me through these intellectual treasures, such that you people would shake like the shaking of ropes when they are down in deep wells, that vibration that goes all the way down, a long, long rope in a deep, deep well, all of you would be shaken to your core, just like those ropes, if I were to tell you everything. But he can't. This sort of knowledge is not communicable. It's a knowledge that can be intuited as present, but not articulated outwardly. That's for each person to realize for himself or herself. But what's very important in this whole process, we're talking about the teacher and the disciple and the student, is that our reason, our intellect is complementary to the revelation, not opposed to it. We will understand more if we look to that revelation as the means by which the qalam, which teaches us, that qalam that we write with, it's the source of all the calligraphic arts, this verse. It starts the revelation. Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min alaq, Iqra, wa rabbuka al-akram, alladhi allama bil-qalam, allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam. We've learned from this qalam, and that qalam, the intellect, the spirit of the Prophet, is the Barakah Muhammadiyya. Because he didn't learn from any. There's a kind of paradox if you look at that verse, in fact, that the very inauguration of the revelation gives us a symbolism that does not apply to the recipient of that revelation. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, he was not taught by the qalam. What was he taught by? His own haqiqah, the haqiqah Muhammadiyya, the first creation, the first thing that became manifest from the divine. This is a kind of ishara, I think, to another verse in the Quran, which is in the surah Al-Qalam, which begins, Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun, by the pen and what they write. Ma anta, now it's addressing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ma anta bi ni'matika bi majnun. You are not a madman by the grace of your Lord. Wa inna laka la ajran ghayra ma, will have an unlimited reward. Wa innaka la ala khuluqin azim. Truly you have a tremendous nature. That tremendous nature in the surah Al-Qalam relates directly to the Noon, which begins the surah, which is Noor. Kunt Imam Ja'far Sadiq, he said the Noon of that surah, Al-Qalam, is the Noor Muhammadi. So the Noor Muhammadi is the khuluq azim. The Prophet himself as a man had tremendous character traits which we should follow. But the true tremendousness of his nature is that he is one with the qalam. He is one with the logos principle that articulates the absolute, that makes the absolute realizable as and through the relative. So these things come together, and we can impart that to students in the measure of our success, our tawfiq, the grace that God gives us to make these realities part of our soul. The love of the Holy Prophet, the love of the Quran, the love of this kind of knowledge, it is what brings together truth and love in a way that will enhance our capacity and the student's capacity to be lovingly receptive to the truth and to be truthful and veracious in relation to love, what is truly lovable. Bring together the two poles so that you don't fall into a sentimentality instead of love, and you don't fall into a kind of erroneous approach to the truth, or subjective error as regards the truth. Harmonize the two principles, and I think